Be sure to leave a comment where you are watching in the world. And check out our new Patreon channel in the description. Thank you, enjoy. To set the stage for this story, we must go back to the far-off year of 1988. The location is the Cascade Mountains of Oregon. I was 10 years old, and with me was my mom, dad, best friend, and our golden retriever, Amber. We were very much an outdoor family, and had many camping trips before this and since. But to this day, when I think about it, I still remember the terror I felt that weekend so long ago. After a brief talk with my father recently, it kind of came back to the front of my mind. He also was able to fill in a few details that I had forgotten. This holiday was like many others. We packed up the station wagon with everything we would need for a hike into one of our favorite lakes to camp at. To make this trip even more exciting for me was the fact it was my birthday weekend, and I got to pick this lake. After we arrived at the trailhead and got our packs on, my dad got his sidearm out and strapped it on his belt. In Oregon, open carry was permitted in national forests, and my dad always had a gun on his hip while in the woods, which always added a sense of security. We had a close call with a bear one time in which it came in handy. The lake was about a 4-mile moderate hike in some thick forest, but each trail itself was well maintained and was never very busy, so it was going to be a very pleasant hike in. We started off on our hike, and back in the 80s, it was not uncommon to have your dog off leash on the trails in the forest, so we let Amber run and do her thing. She was a good dog and never ran off for too long or jumped on people. She did love people though, and speaking of people, we had not seen anyone else on the trail after about 2 miles in on the hike, which was nice since it was just all of us talking, laughing, and enjoying nature. My best friend and I started to hike ahead of everyone else because we were so energized and excited about finding the first and best tent spot once we got to the lake. Amber was bounding ahead of us and having a great time too. We were about 20 yards ahead of my parents when Amber stopped dead in her tracks. I thought she maybe saw a chipmunk or something, maybe a bird, but her hackles came up and she let out the lowest of growls. She never growls, so we stopped walking, and I thought maybe a bear or deer or something was just off the trail, and she saw or heard it. We immediately started walking backwards, and my parents caught up to us. My dad asked us what was going on. I told him that Amber is up the trail and is growling at something. He tells us girls to stay back with my mom, and he walks ahead to where Amber was at on the trail. My dad gets up to her and looks around. I hear Amber whimper a bit while looking off the trail. My dad comforts her and calls her back and walks back to us. He says it must have been an animal, and he did not see anything right off the trail or ahead of us. He says to let him take the lead, and we continue to hike. It did not take long before it was forgotten, and Amber and the rest of us are all having a good time again. We arrived at the lake, and much to my delight, there was no one else there camping. The water was clean and blue, and the shade from the trees made the whole scene just perfect. My friend and I found the best spot to set up our tent, and my parents followed suit. After we had camp set up, my folks went off to fish just down the hill, and my friend and I took off with Amber to walk around to the other side of the lake to catch salamanders. We only made it about in 1/8 of a mile when Amber stopped and started to growl. We stopped and looked around and heard brush rustling. Then right in front of us a man walked out of the trees. Amber stayed right by our sides and started to bare her teeth. He was taller than my dad, so at least 6 feet 4 inches, was very skinny, but had very broad shoulders. He was clean cut and was wearing black jeans and a white polo shirt with loafers. I mean, he did not look like he had hiked at all or was even dressed for the outdoors. He almost looked like he came out of church. We just stood there trying to process this situation when Amber began to bark. The guy just stood there, not moving, and he smiled. Like the creepiest smile. It felt like someone who thought that was what a smile was supposed to look like. Amber kept barking, and this got my parents' attention, and they looked up to us and called out to us to come back. We complied and started to walk back towards them. My dad met us halfway and told us to go back to the campsite, and he was going to talk to this guy. We got back to our camp, and my mom sat with us. I could hear my dad asking the guy if he needed help or was he a fellow camper who had just set up a camp away from the lake. My dad was being polite and calm, but I could see he was on guard and trying to feel out the situation. Now is the time to mention that my dad was ex-Army and can be very intimidating when needed. The conversation continues. The guy told my dad he was just on a walk and did not mean to intrude on us. The guy says goodbye and walks back into the woods. My dad walked back to camp, sat down and told us that he thinks the guy may just be a yuppie camper and does not know much about the outdoors. But my dad said that he got a weird vibe off him and would be keeping an eye out for him. Amber stayed by our side and was calm, yet she kept looking towards the direction the guy went. A bit more time goes by, and we have a nice campfire going, and the sun was starting to set. We cooked some dinner and made s'mores afterwards. My friend and I decided to go to our tent and read some books and tell each other some scary stories. Amber followed us to the tent and laid right outside of the door. My parents walked down to the lake to sit, have a beer and just chill. They were never more than 50 yards away. Not long after my parents walked away, I hear Amber start to growl, then we hear footsteps coming from the woods behind our tent. My friend and I turn off our flashlight and go quiet to listen. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the woods. We then hear heavy breathing and a grunting sound. Amber starts to bark, and we then hear the footsteps retreat to the woods. Amber whimpers a bit, and I then hear my parents walking back to the camp. I go out and tell them what happened. My dad said that he heard Amber barking, and that is why they came back up. I ask my dad what we should do. What is going on, and if that strange guy was the one creeping around. He tells me that we will see about moving camp in the morning, since we still have 3 days left on the trip, and nothing has happened to warrant just leaving. But he said that we will play it by ear, and just be a little more vigilant, and if something changes, we will decide what to do next. He tells us to try to get some sleep, and we all turn in for the night. The next morning, we get up and have breakfast. After breakfast, we head down to the lake to fish. It was a beautiful day, and we were having so much fun the events from the prior day were almost forgotten. We decided around lunchtime that we would go for a short hike to the waterfall that is up from the lake. We were gone for only about an hour, and when we came back, we found our tents opened and our sleeping bags drug out on the ground. My dad tells us to hang back with Mom, and he goes to investigate. He comes back and says nothing is missing, but it was not an animal that did this. He says we should break camp, hike back to the car, and find another spot to camp for the next couple of days. I could tell my dad was not wanting to frighten us, but I heard the urgency in his voice. I was very disappointed, but if it meant we could enjoy the rest of the trip and not worry about some creep messing with us, then it was worth it. We broke camp and started our hike back. Dad was in the lead, and we were double timing it and made it back to car in record time. As we walk over to the car, we see that one of our tires was flat. Not a big deal, we always had a spare, but when my dad bent down to start taking the lugs off, we swore. It was not just flat, someone slashed the tire. Dad changed that tire in record time, and we threw everything into the car, and he goes to turn the car on, but it would not start. Dad swears, gets out of the car and pops the hood. He says shit. It turns out someone took our spark plug wires. Old cars like that Chevy wagon did not have internal hood releases. You could just pop the hood from the outside. Dad slams the hood, says some very colorful words, and kicks some rocks. We were stuck, and no one else was at the trailhead. We were stranded. My parents are calm under pressure, and after a few minutes of discussion, it was decided that Dad would start walking down the road until he could hitch a ride to town and go to the auto parts store. Mom and the rest of us were going to wait with the car and look for someone to hopefully pull into the trailhead and help us. A few of hours go by, and no one has come to the trailhead. It is getting hot, and we are hungry and tired. My mom makes us some lunch, and we go to sit under a tree to cool off. Amber is by our side and was calm, but then we hear a voice. Amber leaps up and starts to whimper. The creepy guy from yesterday comes down the trail and is asking my mom if we need help. My mom tells him we are fine, that it is being settled, and my dad will be back soon. This creep then tells her that his camp is close, and he is parked on the old fire road that is near the lake and asks us if we would like to come back to his camp and wait until my dad returns. Mom sternly tells him no, that we will just wait here and thank you anyway. He does not like this. He tells my mom that it is not safe out here for a pretty lady and 2 young girls. My mom, like my dad, is no pushover and asserts herself again that we do not need any help and to please just leave us alone. The guy just stands there, smiles wide, and then just turns around and leaves. My mom is visibly shaken, and us girls were just a bit scared. My mom comes over to us and tells us that we need to stay close, do not wander, and that we will be okay. My friend and I are really kind of freaked out and are just hoping my dad will make it back soon. After about another 30 minutes, the creepy guy comes back. This time, though, he is not alone and has a slightly younger guy with him. The other guy is dressed as a yuppie camper and had a very stern look on his face. My mother stands her ground as they approach. Amber starts to low growl and her hackles go up. The 2 guys flank us, and one of them flashes a gun tucked into his belt. The older guy tells us that we need to go with them, and that they were not asking. My mom backs up next to us, and without taking her eyes off them reaches to her belt and pulls out her Bowie knife. My mom said we will not be going, and that they need to leave now. The two men did not even flinch at this and said that we will come with them, or they will hurt us. At this moment, though, Amber goes from just growling to barking and puts herself between us and them. This makes the guys stop. My mom yells that they need to leave now. They start backing up, and at that moment we hear a truck pulling into the trailhead parking lot. At the sight of the truck, the guys start to walk away fast and disappear into the tree line. The truck was a forest ranger, and he had my dad with him. My dad jumped out of the truck and ran over to us, asking if we were okay. The ranger came over and asked who those men were, and if we were okay. My mom explained everything while my dad hugged us girls and told us we will be okay. The ranger takes off to go looking for the men. My dad tells us that he was about 5 miles from the town when the ranger picked him up and took him the rest of the way to get the part for the car. He then drove him back to our car. After hearing what happened, my dad was pissed and wanted to find the guys who tried to kidnap us and that had been terrorizing us for the past 24 hours. The ranger came back and told us that he had almost caught up to them, but they sped away in their truck with a camper in tow. They had been parked behind a small ridge behind the lake on an old logging road. He did not get a plate, but he radioed a description of the men and their truck and camper to the local sheriff's office. He also took our information and said he would pass it on to them. He waited with us until Dad had the car fixed, and we were able to leave. We decided to not continue camping and instead drive a couple of hours to spend the last 2 days of the trip at the beach and stay in a hotel. A few days later, a deputy called my dad and told him they never did find the men. He said that it was most likely a crime of opportunity after seeing a woman with 2 girls in tow. He was sure they had been watching us from off the trail and had messed with our camp to judge how my dad would react. When my dad seemed to be too big of a threat, they sabotaged our car, hoping to put us in a position where we were vulnerable. He said they would follow up with us if they find out anything else, but according to my dad, nothing ever came of it. Years later, I tried to do some research on crimes in that area of Oregon during the 80s that might have involved something like we experienced. All I could find was a few reports of campers being robbed and a few cars broken into. There was one case of a young lady and her dog going missing from an area near there, but it was never determined what had happened to her, or even if it was something bad or she just ran away. I can tell you that we did go back to that lake a few years later and had a very uneventful camping trip. It was nice to go back and find some joy in a spot that was special to me. I really hope those creepy guys never hurt anyone, and maybe were caught for other crimes. I will never know, though. I just hope to never run into a situation like that again. I can say that having a dog along with us helped our situation. She was the hero and kept us alert. Amber went on to live until she was 12 years old and passed with her favorite people around her. Remember to stay safe, stay watchful, and it never hurts to have a sweet, brave dog with you. It was the summer of 2016, and I had just married my longtime girlfriend. Over the course of our 12-year relationship, we had traveled to the mountains several times in both summer and winter for camping, but also to stay in nice mountain hotels and snowboard the slopes. Naturally, we both agreed this was how we wanted to spend the first few weeks of our marriage. We booked a 20-day stay at a mountainside campground on the other side of the country. We also decided to bring our dogs with us, as they too love being outdoors, and we generally bring them camping anyway. After 2 days of road tripping, we had arrived, quickly set up and settled in for a good long stay on the mountain. It was beautiful. A couple of days into our trip, and we had already met a bunch of fellow campers. We are very experienced campers, so we generally attract a lot of attention from novice campers asking for tools or supplies as they see we are well set up. We are usually more than happy to help people get situated if they need matches, cream or sugar, or help setting up their equipment. It was day 4 or 5 when she first made her presence known to us. I will refer to this person as she or Herb, as we never learned her name. We were sitting down under the shade of the large pine tree at the edge of our site, drinking beers and playing cards when she seemingly appeared out of nowhere. She was just suddenly right there. "Can I pet your dog?" she said. Even my dogs didn't see her approach, as the very sound of her voice triggered them into a startled frenzy. As the dogs were worked up already, I politely told her no. Then she just stood there at the edge of our site, didn't say a word, just stood there sort of existing, but not really doing anything. She wasn't exactly staring at us, or looking at anything in particular. I asked her if she needed anything, and she said no. After a few minutes, she walked off. I work with people with brain injuries, so I've had my fair share of experiences with unusual behaviors, including people with poor social skills, so I wasn't about to write this person off as creepy just yet. But she had my attention. I casually watched her walk off and enter a campsite across the path and a few sites down from ours. There was already a small tent set up in the site, but she proceeded to pull an even smaller single-person tent from her backpack and began setting it up. The day prior, we saw two young girls set up the other tent and were clearly the occupants of the site. There was no further interaction with her that day, although we did notice that the owners of the other tent on the site were not around at all that day, and we didn't see them return that night. Well, the next morning I am walking to the camp showers to clean up for the day. As I walk past her site, I see she is sitting in her little tent reading a book. The door to the tent is open. I pay no attention and keep on my way to take my shower. When I'm done my shower and walking back, I notice her tent is now closed, but it's jiggling about, so I know someone is in there. Then she made her presence known in a big way. Just as I am approaching her site on the way to mine, she unzips her tent, and I immediately see that she is completely nude. She then positions herself just inside the tent at the door and lets out this over-the-top full-body stretch, and held her arms way up the sky while pushing her chest forward like it was some kind of mating ritual designed just for me. While she does this, she lets out what I only describe as an exotic moan. It was pretty obvious she was putting on a show for me. I continue on my way to my site and tell my wife about the display I had just been witness to. We both laughed it off and moved on with our plans to today hike a good trail to a waterfall. The trailhead for this hike was accessible from the campgrounds, so we didn't have to drive to get there. We just walked the additional 2 kilometers to the trail. We walked at a good pace, so when we got to the trail we decided to stop for a few minutes and take some photos of the surrounding mountains before heading into the thicker bush. After sitting there for maybe 5 minutes while my wife is taking pictures, she emerges from the trail that leads towards the campground. At first I thought, okay, coincidence, she's staying here, and this is a pretty common trail. But then she sees that I see her, and she stops dead in her tracks and just stands there. Same demeanor as our first encounter. Just standing, not doing anything in particular, but also sending creep vibes our way. This was the first time I said to my wife, I think we have a stalker. Confused, my wife then looks to where I'm looking, and is immediately a little creeped out. Once again I think, whatever, maybe she's just hiking the trail, no big deal. So we continue on the trail at a good pace, and she maintains a consistent distance behind us. Our dogs at this point are a little distracted by her, and our youngest dog keeps turning around to watch her. I got a little fed up with the dog constantly stopping to look back, so I decided we will stop for some water and let this woman pass. Well, what does she do but fucking stop walking when we stop, and once again just stands there. Okay, so now we are genuinely concerned because this is approaching horror/suspense movie creep level, and I start to wonder what this girl's intentions are. Standing motionless at that distance and refusing to pass us just ramped up the oh shit factor to about 9. So my wife and I agree to just give her and cut the hike short by taking the shorter loop, which was only another half kilometer ahead, and head back to our camp. We managed to get some distance between us by jogging every time we would make a turn, and she was out of sight. We didn't see her again until later that night. That night my wife decided to take an evening shower at the camp showers. When she returned to our camp, she tells me our stalker was in the bathrooms, also taking a shower. This time, however, she was with 2 other girls and appeared to be getting ready for a night at the club. There is a nearby ski town that has a few night clubs and bars, so it was reasonable to see the girls getting ready for a night out. The 2 girls she was with were the 2 we saw previously set up at her site. My wife explains that she quickly picked up on the fact that the 2 girls and our stalker friend were not well known to each other. It was clear that the 2 girls were close friends with plans to go out partying, and our stalker was making an attempt to be friends and sort of invited herself to join them in their night out. Now we know the ski town well, and the girls kept reinforcing that they were meeting at a specific restaurant before going to the bar. It was currently 10:30 p.m., and we know the restaurant they were telling her to go to was closed at 10 p.m. They were lying to her about their plans. The stalker kept asking them too, "Are you sure this place? Are you sure?" They convinced her, and she then left to her tent to finish getting ready while the 2 friends stayed in the bathroom to finish their makeup. My wife went on to explain how after she left, the two friends were mocking and making fun of our stalker. They were young 20-somethings acting like little girls in elementary school. My wife has no time for that creepy stalker, or not. She had to say something to the girls for their behavior. My wife calls them out on their behavior. Well, putting all the catty bitch bullying aside, the girls explained to my wife that the stalker girl had set up her tent on their site when they were staying with a friend in the ski town. When they returned, they found her living at their site without invitation. She had just taken it upon herself to take a little corner of their site without knowing them at all. The girls said they were upset with her and trying to make her feel uncomfortable so she would leave, but she wouldn't leave. Of course, my wife asked them why they didn't just report her to the park warden. The excuse they gave was they were leaving the next day and didn't want to make a huge deal out of it. So whatever happened between them and the fake late dinner plans and clubbing is unknown to us. About 3 a.m. that same night, we are all awoken to a blood-curdling scream right outside our camper. At first I was like, holy shit, that must be a wild animal. My wife is trembling, dogs barking, and I am startled but curious. I peel back the window cover to see her, standing motionless on the path outside our trailer. I had the window cover down maybe 8 to 10 centimeters when she appears to make direct eye contact with me. My heart rate is jacked. What the actual fuck? After gazing in my general direction for what seemed like an eternity, she calmly turns around and walks to her tent. I go make sure our trailer is locked. After a good hour and a stiff whiskey, we manage to get back to sleep. So the next day is a Friday. We have friends from a nearby major city coming up the mountains to spend the weekend with us. We haven't seen them in a while, so we are excited for a couple days together. Well, they are not at our site for 15 minutes, and as they are setting up their tent, she mysteriously appears out of nowhere yet again. Like bam, there she is, but now this time she is actually in our sight. I hadn't had a chance to tell our friends about her before she arrived, so they were a little more friendly than I was. She asks me once again if she can pet my dog, who during all of this is barking at her. I think I said something like, she isn't being very friendly towards you right now, so I would prefer if you didn't. She didn't pet my dog, but she also just stood there staring at me like she was considering how she would dismember my limbs. She then notices our friend's tent brand as he is still setting it up and comments on how it's the same model as hers, although a larger sleeping capacity. My buddy has picked up on the creep vibes and my general displeasure with her presence, so just gives her the, oh yeah cool, and keeps setting it up. Well, she starts grabbing at the tent pegs and picks up the hammer and says she will help him set it up cause she has experience with it. My buddy declines and asks for his tools back. Cue the fucking psychopath stare down, but this time she has a hammer in hand, adding to the oh shit factor. She literally just drops everything right there and runs off. I go on to explain the last few days to our friends, and they agree we need to keep an eye on her. So by this time the two girlfriends whose site she had hijacked were packed up and gone. It's now Friday night, and we've been drinking all day, so we're feeling pretty good. It's maybe about 11 p.m. when she walks over to our site again. She says, "Hey, you guys seem to have a lot of extra room with the tent and the camper. Do you think I could stay with you guys tonight? We could have a lot of fun in there together." My buddy is feeling pretty good from all the day beers, so he's pretty forward when he replies, "Did you just propose a gangbang to us?" Now this whole time I'm just sitting in my camp chair with my whiskey taking this all in. She wasn't really taking notice to me at all so far. Then she smiles, turns her head and looks directly down at me and says, "I like your friend." She then turns around and walks away into the darkness of the night towards the forest. What the fuck? We are all now terrified she is going to return. I decided right then and there if we see her again in a creepy fashion, I am calling the park warden. This is getting silly. Well, the night is winding down, so we all decide to walk together to the bathrooms to clean up for bed. My wife pulls on my hoodie and says, "Babe, look." I look over to see that the site she was set up on is completely destroyed. Shit everywhere. Just stuff, garbage, clothing, food. Everywhere. I thought, okay, this is weird. Could this have been a bear? No, we would have heard it. I then noticed that the tent is gone. She is gone and left the site a complete mess. As luck would have it, the park patrol was completing their fire rounds and were at the messed up site when we were returning from the bathrooms. We told them there was a girl staying on her who was acting erratic, and we suspected she was squatting on the site based on our conversation with the two girls from earlier in the week. We didn't see her again for the rest of our trip until the last full day. There is a great little lookout point not far from our site, which has amazing views of the river and valley below, and it was a perfect evening to see the sunset behind the mountains. It was a lovely final send-off to an otherwise beautiful honeymoon. Just when we thought we were done with her, she emerged once again from seemingly nowhere. We were sitting on a couple chairs that are bolted in place at the viewpoint, taking pictures of the valley below. As my wife is looking through the camera viewfinder, she picks up on the woman in the distance. She is standing in woods a little ways down mountain towards the valley, watching us. As her final act, she walked up the mountainside and sat right beside us on a boulder that was beside the chairs. She says nothing, just sits there. My wife has the brilliant idea of asking me to take one last picture of the scenery, and she gives me a little wink. I pick up on her idea right away, and I position myself, so this woman is going to be in the picture. My wife wanted this lady's photo in the event something bad happens with her, before we can leave the area. We took our final looks out at the beautiful scenery, and headed to our camp for the night. We didn't see or hear from her again. Upon reflection, we agreed this woman had some serious mental health issues, obviously. She had zero social skills, and we did witness her attempt to make friends with those two girls that shafted her in a terrible way. That being said, she did things way beyond the realm of acceptable social awkwardness. There were moments I thought she would pull out a knife and kill us all where we stood. More than that, the stalking, the midnight screaming and running off into the woods at night was terrifying to us, and I feel a story worthy of this sub. I do have the photo on a thumb drive somewhere, and we'll see about uploading a pixelated photo if it's appropriate. To anyone else, the picture just looks like a person is sitting in the shot. But to us, it's a reminder of our wild adventure and start of our amazing marriage. Back in 2016, my friends and I, for the longest time, had been itching to go camping to our local camping site in the Los Padres National Park in Southern California. When we found the perfect weekend to go to that didn't interfere with any of our work schedules, we set the date. 3 days before the trip, we found out we were going to get hit by the El Nino rainstorm. Us, being the type of dudes that we are, didn't care if we got hit by the storm while camping. So we packed up our cars and made the 45-minute drive to the campsite. The campsite was a family-friendly one, where there were about 100 camping lots that circled around the clearing in the forest. We found the perfect spot that was underneath huge thick trees that would help block as much rain as possible, and it helped out that the restrooms were only 30 yards away. As soon as we got to our spot, we took advantage of the afternoon sky being cleared for the moment, and we rushed to set up our spot. The layout that we did was that we pitched our tents close by, where our tent doors were only 6 feet apart. The reason why we did this is because, in order to combat the rain, I brought a 30-foot by 30-foot thick blue canopy tarp that I threw over to cover us from the rain above and from the rain that would be running through the ground. It was a genius move on my part, but whenever you would walk around our tent, you would be making so much noise from crunching the plastic tarp. Hours passed, and we were all around the campfire. It was late into the evening, and this was the first time that I noticed that there were barely any other campers. They were mainly camping in their RVs like the fake campers they were. In honest opinion, they were the smart ones, unlike my friends and I that were sleeping in 2 small tents, with our only protection being the blue tarp. I was getting tired from a long day of work, and I decided that I was going off to knock out. My friends followed my lead as well. The way that the sleeping arrangements were was that I had my friend Ray sleeping in my tent, and Ajay and S were sleeping in theirs. Before I called it a night, I whispered to Ray and told him, "I'm going to prank call S and Ajay, but I'm not going to say anything." Ray smiled as I dialed my friends up. I called them on restricted, and S's phone started to ring off. Both of them, being the way that they are, got timid very easily as they said to one another, "Who's calling you this late in the night?" "I don't know, they called me on restricted." "Are you going to answer?" "Of course not." Ray and I were holding in our laughter as they ignored our call. I decided to do it one more time. Once their phone started to ring, they started to freak out once again, and they said, "Who is it this time?" "Same person, I think." "I'm going to answer." As they did answer, S said in a very shaking tone, H, hello?" Ray and I had to hold in our laughter as we kept as quiet as possible, not wanting to make any noises that would give off that it was us. I held the phone close to my mouth as I began to breathe heavily in a murderous way. I ended the call, and just hearing them freak out the way they did was making my night even funner. Me being the idiot that I am, called them one more time, and this time, S picked up the phone immediately and said in a tough voice, "Look, whoever this is better stop. I am about to call the cops if you keep on calling. This is not a threat." Ray and I looked at one another as we, at the same time, began to fake moan so loud and immediately started to bawl out in laughter. Ajay and S were so mad at us for pulling this prank on us, and they were cursing us out. Me, finally calming down from laughing so loudly, told the boys, "Good night. I will have pancakes ready in the morning." Since I fell asleep relatively easily, I was out in a matter of minutes, while Ray, Ajay, and S were up for a while longer. I was the first of my friends to wake up in the morning, and as I promised, I had the pancakes already cooking by the time that anyone else woke up. The smell of me cooking woke up my friends, and one by one, they got out of their tents. As we were eating, Ajay spoke up and said, "Hey Jay, the prank that you pulled last night went a little too far. Yeah, you had us ready to run to our car and take off." Me, feeling a bit guilty, apologized and said, "Sorry guys, my bad. Yeah, it's one thing to prank call us like that, but then to walk around our tent and then go inside it in the middle of the night is totally out of limits." S said, me not knowing what they were talking about, said, "What do you guys mean? Come on, still with the jokes. You were the one that was walking around our tent, and you walked in." Ray spoke up and said, "That wasn't Jay who was walking around. I thought that was you two getting your revenge on us for scaring you. That wasn't us doing that. It was you two." So to explain, after I fell asleep, about an hour had passed where Ray, S, and Ajay were still up and all was quiet in the forest until the sounds of footsteps were heard stepping on our blue tarp that was on the ground. At first, my friends thought that it could have been just a forest animal wandering around, but the heavy footsteps were a dead giveaway that it was a person. As they described, the person was walking all around our tents, making constant figure eights. The person would place their fingers on the tent's fabric walls to run them up and down. The footsteps finally stopped after a couple of minutes, right in between our tent's doors. The three of them were already having their hearts pounding out of their chest. It was silent for a long minute until the sound of the tent's zipper being slid open. As Ajay says, the tent's door was only opened halfway, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. But in the darkness, both S and Ajay saw the silhouette of a man's face pop his head into the tent to look at both of them. Ajay and S faked being asleep the entire time, but they kept their eyes locked onto the man. The man then opened the tent fully and walked inside the tent, just standing at the entrance. The man didn't say a word or do anything, just watched the both of them laying in their sleeping bags. After their longest minute ever, the man just took his steps out of the tent, and his footsteps were heard walking away, disappearing into the night. The entire time that this was happening, S and Ajay thought that it was either me or Ray doing this, and Ray thought that it was Ajay or S doing this. Back to us arguing back and forth at the breakfast table. We were interrupted by a man walking to our campsite, and he said, "Good morning, boys. How did the four of you sleep last night?" This man spoke in a smoker's voice, as if he has been doing that for all of his 45 years of being alive. He wore a dirty, sweat-stained white t-shirt that looked more gray at this point, and his blue jeans looked as if they had never been taken off from his pants. He smelt like liquor, not a good sign at 8 in the morning, and his words were just mumbling around. We didn't say a word to this guy as he then asked us if we had any cigarettes to spare him. I said that we didn't smoke, and he said, "Oh, well, if you boys want to visit me in my RV, just stop by any time." The man continued to walk away, towards the restrooms, and as he was done using it, he walked back to our campsite. He didn't say anything this time, but he looked at us and gave us a nearly toothless smile, and he walked back to his RV. I took note of his RV, as it was the only RV that stuck out as being dirty and more run down than the others. We quickly summed up the man as the person who was walking around our tents last night, and S and Ajay now remembered that they smelt liquor from the person who was standing in their tent. We all agreed that we would keep an extra eye out on this guy, and if he did spend another night, we would most likely report him to the park rangers if he tried anything else. When it was around lunchtime now, the man came back, not to use the restroom, but just to talk to us. "So, are any of you boys interested in buying a RV? You all can go check it out right now, and see if you want to buy it. I don't need it anymore since my wife left me. Just check out the inside of the RV." "No, we are good, sir," I said with a visible threatening tone. The man seemed to notice this, and he walked away. The man did end up leaving a few hours before sunset, but the entire time that he was there, he kept glancing at us. The man had his RV about 50 yards away from us, and I noticed that he had a restroom right next to his RV. Why did he make an effort in walking all the way over to our campsite to use our restroom? Also, why did he even use ours if RVs come with restrooms installed in them? Whatever the man wanted, we were just glad that we were about to enjoy the rest of our weekend. I posted this in Missing 411, and in my planning of my upcoming camping trips felt the urge to post it here. Mostly a copy and paste with an update on one of the family members. This may be a ramble of thoughts, but after recently stumbling on this sub, I finally felt a place I could offer something that my family and I experienced a few years ago that to this day gives me a shiver. I have been camping, solo backpacking, and hunting my whole life in Oregon, and felt comfortable in the woods and have a deep respect for nature. A few years ago, my wife, daughter, and 2 German shepherds went camping north of Mt. Jefferson, Oregon. I have included the coordinates of our campsite, which we found to be the perfect setup for us and our 2 dogs who need the privacy, since they are intimidating to other dog owners and can be loud when spooked. It was not an established campsite, just a nice horseshoe off a USFS road that had flat ground full trees and a fire pit. The first night my daughter wanted to sleep by herself in a 2-man tent right next to ours. It was maybe 2 feet away from me and my wife's tent. We made the male German shepherd sleep, Guts is his name, with her in the tent. That whole first night neither my wife and I could sleep. We both heard footsteps, and they were heavy, not like typical forest critters scampering around the night. I was well armed because I was paranoid from reading recently before departing about a dad in California who was shot and killed in a tent next to his 2 infant daughters. Needless to say, both my wife and I had 2 pistols and my rifle with me. The dogs are great at detection, and that is why I felt my daughter could sleep alone, because Guts is completely fearless and nothing would lay a hand on her without a battle to the death. All in all, nothing but bad vibes and loud footsteps occurred that night, which I ultimately decided was deer or maybe some elk. Day 2. Morning. We go for a walk down the road, and maybe 300 feet away see the circle area in the photo. I see an abandoned road where a rusted gate post, gate was missing, was covered in vegetation. Something of blue color caught my eye, and Guts immediately takes off running down this abandoned road. My heart begins to race, because I think it's another family camping like us, and he is going to get himself shot or scare some innocent people to death. So I chase after him as fast as I can, and the rest follow. He stops after 20 feet into the road, and me yelling his name, but I have covered just enough distance to see that there is nobody there, and something is off about the sight. I yell, "Hello, is anyone there? Sorry about the dog." I got no response. My curiosity gets the best of me, and I have to see what the site conditions were. As I get closer, I know something is wrong. It had all the necessities for a campsite, including a cooler, propane burner, tent, blankets, folding table, but every single item had been completely destroyed, smashed and torn from what appeared to be claw marks. We all walked around in circles, puzzled why anyone would leave all their camping gear behind, including an expensive REI tent. I figured, well, someone left in a hurry, and animals got to the rest, as the only logical explanation. Still, a propane tank and cooler were flattened by something, and it certainly wasn't snowpack with tree coverage in that spot. As the afternoon rolls in me, and my daughter are playing bocce ball at the campsite, and my wife goes walking maybe 70 foot north to do her business. I do not have direct line of sight on her, but all of a sudden I see Guts make a mad dash straight towards her. Normally he would always be with me unless he is called over, and she didn't call for him. His speed and focus caught my attention, and I knew something weird was happening. So I ran over there, and my wife starts jogging at me, and I immediately draw my pistol. Guts has completely continued running into the forest another 100 feet before I call him, and he stopped. My other dog, Leah, who never misses the opportunity to be the pack leader, is not taking point. I have had her for now 7 years, and this was the first time in her life she refused to leave my daughter's side. She was full hair raised and attached to us at the hip. Again, anytime we hike or play, Leah is up front bossing everything in her path and pauses to look to see where we are and continues. I asked my wife what happened, and she said, "I was trying to pee and all of a sudden I felt all my hairs raise. I know someone was watching me. And then I saw Guts running towards me, and I just got up to move towards you." We spent 10 minutes looking for signs of anything and saw no trails, broken branches, nothing to point to what and where something went. We decide we are spending one more night, since it's too late to pack up and drive, but we will all be in the big tent together. Before we go to bed, I put a rope with a makeshift coin alarm around the perimeter of our campsite. I used a mint can and some coins and keys from our truck and zip-tied it, so anything hitting the rope gave a little jingle. Very unsophisticated, but it put my wife at ease. As I go to tie my last corner off at a tree near our tent, our third mystery item unveils itself. It looks like someone has done the same exact thing I have done with a rope that was so old and brown I didn't see it at first. It was broken and only a few pieces remained, but sure enough it was tied at roughly the same height, 8-10 in off the ground, and even had a few rusted washers on it. I immediately felt someone has stayed here before and put the same makeshift warning system on the same tree, maybe 10 to 15 years ago, based on the condition of the rope. Perhaps my paranoia has now reached a new height, but I had to make sure the girls felt we are safe, and at the time the only thing I could think of was when the evening came around I made them sit in the truck, and I fired a clip of my .45 into the dirt as a signal to whatever was out there that we are armed. I reassured the girls that anybody listening to that now knows we have 2 wolves and are armed, and we are too risky of a target, so we can sleep safely. That night we heard no footsteps, and the dogs never perked up and barked. We left early the next morning. Fast forward to today, and I watched the Amazon Missing 411 Hunted documentary, and I noticed the cluster smack dab close to where we camped that weekend, and a flood of dread rushes me as I think of that mysterious abandoned campsite with the ripped tent and smashed cooler and cooktop. We have been camping since and have enjoyed the beauty of the NW, but there was something there at that place that possibly took or harmed someone else less than 300 feet away from where we camped, and we all thank our lucky stars Guts was doing his thing so well that afternoon. I'm not sure if I'm in the right place, but I've held this story in for the last 6 years because it sounds crazy, and I got told not to talk about it. I went camping 6 years ago with a now ex-boyfriend of mine. The campsite we picked was beautiful. We were able to drive in through some rough trails. The spot we picked was next to some hiking trails that weren't very far from some natural hot springs and a huge waterfall. We were in the middle of nowhere, absolutely no one was around. We set up camp next to the car, went hiking, soaked in the hot springs, came back and had dinner. It was all very normal, until we woke up the next day. I need to give some context as to how we slept that night, so you can understand my confusion. Before we went to sleep, I put our food cooler and a stereo that we brought in the car and locked it. I put the keys in the front pocket of my backpack, and put the backpack next to my sleeping bag on the far side of the tent away from the door of the tent. My boyfriend at the time slept nearest the door of the tent with a gun next to him. We woke up the next morning, and I felt fine. I had slept hard, and from inside the tent everything seemed normal. When we got out, our campsite was absolute chaos. The fire pit we had made was ruined. The cooler had been thrown and food was scattered all over the place. The stereo was smashed to pieces laying next to a tree. All of the car doors were open, including the trunk. We stood there for a minute in silence, just taking everything in. The woods felt off now. It was quiet and not the beautiful campsite that I saw yesterday. Everything about those woods felt wrong now. My ex accused me of not locking the car the night before, and that an animal got in our stuff. I promised that I had locked it, and went into the tent to grab the keys from my backpack, but they weren't there. I found them later on the ground, right next to the car. We quickly threw everything in the trunk and left. My boyfriend was quiet and wouldn't talk to me about what had just happened. He finally spoke up when we were almost home and told me that he had had a dream the night before about something kneeling over him in the tent holding his gun and just staring at him. When I tried to ask him more questions, he got quiet again and said he didn't want to talk about it and that I shouldn't talk about it anymore either. I've tried to forget about it, but I just can't. Something really wrong happened to us in the woods that night. This started when I was at my childhood friend's apartment for what was supposed to be a fun little movie night. We hadn't hung out in a while, and we were catching up. Her place was cozy, a little disorganized, and full of girly decor. We were in our comfiest sweatpants about to watch princess movies. Her apartment isn't the most tidy. Things are a bit scattered around, but it's clean and so authentic, which always made me feel at home. We decided on ordering pizza for dinner. She mentioned that Sherwood, someone I hadn't met yet, would bring the pizza over. At first, I was not happy to hear that. I thought that meant she had invited other friends, a boy, over to join us, which wasn't what I had in mind. But I was in for a surprise. Sherwood turned out to just be our delivery guy for the night. He wasn't joining us. When he got to the apartment, there was this awkward air about him. He was obviously nervous, fumbling a bit with the pizza boxes, and not quite making eye contact. My friend introduced us quickly, and it was clear from her overly thankful demeanor that Sherwood did a lot more for her than just fetch dinner. After handing us the pizza, there was this brief moment of forced small talk. My friend was super nice to him despite his awkwardness. He wasn't the best conversationalist and seemed really out of place. Then Sherwood asked for my number. I was in a tough spot because our mutual friend was sitting right there, so I just gave it to him. Yeah, we chatted for maybe 5 minutes before my friend gave him a cue to leave with something like, "Thanks so much for dropping this off." He seemed to get the hint. We both gave him a hug before my friend said something like, "Drive safe," giving him another kind of cue to leave. When I asked my friend what that was all about, she basically explained that Sherwood was her unpaid personal assistant. He did her grocery shopping, he dropped off pizza, and he did all this other stuff. I think Sherwood was just a really lonely guy desperate for interaction, especially female interaction. My friend and I were both young and immature back then. We were about 23, but I think we both knew something was seriously wrong with Sherwood. It was a little hard to articulate because we couldn't point out exactly what his problem was. Sherwood started a group chat with my friend and me. He just sent a meme or two every week. It felt like he was trying to stay relevant without being intrusive. Maybe he was used to being sidelined or even blocked by other girls in the past. It felt like he was trying to make me remember him, but also carefully trying not to give me a reason to block him too. I can't speak on his behalf. That's just what it felt like. Sherwood also offered help with errands. The first time, I said thanks for asking, but no. He asked every weekend after that. One day, I made the mistake of accepting his help. I knew better. I had recently found a great deal for a new washing machine on Craigslist, but I had no idea how to pick it up and install it. When I mentioned it in the chat, Sherwood excitedly volunteered to take care of the whole thing. He handled the whole pickup and installation like a total champ, which saved me so much hassle. I tried to pay him for his efforts because I wanted to show appreciation, but he wouldn't accept any money. I insisted. Eventually, he suggested that I could repay him by joining him for a hike. Like what? I was uneasy about this. It felt a bit too personal, and almost like it could be mistaken for a date. But Sherwood framed it as nothing more than a friendly outing, like a transaction to balance out the favor. I agreed to the hike. I rationalized it by telling myself it was fair trade for installing the washing machine, and that it was genuinely a form of payment, especially since I didn't think he had too many friends. This hike felt like maybe a way for him to have some companionship. I thought it might be nice helping him. Part of me was still uneasy about spending time with him in such an isolated setting. The day of the hike, Sherwood picked this trail that was nearby. I had been there before. It's gorgeous. As we walked along together, he chatted about ordinary things like work, the weather, and his hobbies. Everything seemed normal until he suggested we go off the main path to see something special he wanted to share. Like, what could that even mean? We reached this secluded spot, and there, oh my gosh, was a dead body. My heart pounded so violently as Sherwood stood there, so eerily calm and nonchalant. The casualness in his demeanor made me feel even more uneasy. It felt like he wasn't just showing me a dead body, but also revealing this darker side of himself. It smelled bad, but not like in the movies. I didn't know how long it had been there. I am not a biologist, but my guess is that it had smelled a lot worse before, but now it had gone down. At that moment, I mumbled some excuse about needing to get back quickly and started walking briskly towards the main path. I was urging Sherwood to follow me. I thought maybe this was some twisted mind game, like a way to intimidate me or show that he wasn't just some harmless little boy. Maybe he was trying to send a message that said, "You should know I'm familiar with things like this." Or there's another possibility. Maybe he just wanted me to think about him more. Sometimes when I talk to people, I feel like they only notice me for the time that we're together, and then they won't think of me again until the next time we meet. It's possible Sherwood felt that way with me, and maybe he thought showing me a dead body would make him less forgettable. I have no idea, but on the surface, he seemed oblivious to how inappropriate this was. As we walked back together, I was in full fight or flight mode, instinctively looking around to see if there were other hikers or rangers, anyone who could make me feel like I wasn't alone. The moment I spotted someone else on the trail, I called out, not to expose Sherwood, but just asking for directions back to the parking area. I wanted to make sure Sherwood and I wouldn't be left alone together. I asked this gentleman to walk us back to the parking lot. I wasn't going to take no for an answer. I kept pretending like I was confused about his directions, and eventually he agreed to just walk us there. Getting help from that guy was my way of re-anchoring myself to safety and normality, while I was still under the shock of what Sherwood had shown me. We got to the parking area. There, I called my friend and told her I was with Sherwood. I suggested he could drop me off with her, and that we'd be there in 20 minutes. Sherwood agreed. That was my way of making sure that if anything happened, it was on the record that Sherwood was the last person to have been with me. Also, I immediately texted my friend what had happened to get that on the record too. When I got to her apartment, we said thanks to Sherwood and kindly told him to go away. I had already told her through text, but then I started going into all the detail. The fact that the body had insects, the fact that the face was decomposing but still recognizable, etc. Her reaction was pure horror. Not just about the dead body, but also how nonchalantly Sherwood had treated the whole situation. She confessed she always sensed something was off about him, even though she'd never imagined anything this disturbing. We both agreed that we needed to remove Sherwood from our lives. She admitted she felt stuck, and she had become too reliant on Sherwood to just fire him cold turkey. We planned out how we would do it. It was this gradual phasing out plan. We would limit our interactions to times when others were present. We would slowly reduce our responses to his texts. I would never ask for his help again, and my friend would ask for less and less help. Sherwood kept texting during weekends, offering to run errands or asking if we needed anything. To which my friend would reply, "I'm trying to work on being more independent, but you've really been such a help." Eventually, as my friend started dating someone new, she introduced Sherwood to her boyfriend. Sherwood never contacted her after that. I had called the cops the same night of the incident, but it was a while before we heard more news about it. At least a full month later, a news report confirmed discovering a dead body in that area where Sherwood had taken me hiking. They made an arrest, not of Sherwood, but of this other guy that Sherwood followed on Instagram. I have no idea if Sherwood was connected to the murder. Reflecting on everything, I think there's one clear moral of the story. Trust your instincts. I've never posted to Reddit before. This is my first time. My brother suggested I tell my story here. I am a 33-year-old white female from Los Angeles. 3 years ago, my boyfriend and I, as planned for 5 years, turned 30, sold everything we owned, including my car, took his Trailblazer, and decided to just travel around the States and Canada. I guess you could call us backpackers, as we tend to chase good weather, find a state park and backcountry hike into the wilderness for days at a time. My brother likes to joke that we are anti-establishment hippies. We don't necessarily live off the grid, but between the two of us we have one prepaid phone we use for emergencies or checking in with family and friends, and one MacBook which I use for work. I'm a freelance writer/content creator, and I am on retainer with robotics company. I mostly write boring white papers or web content. The whole point of our living situation is to live debt-free and have as few bills as possible. I only use free Wi-Fi, so 1 to 2 times a week we have to go to a city with a Starbucks. This background info is only important so you know more about who we are and how simply we live. Neither of us is involved in social media and know very little of Reddit or Instagram or use any apps. Because our phone isn't a smartphone, we don't even text. Last summer we decided to do some backcountry hiking in Arkansas. It's one of those states you don't ever really hear about other hikers visiting, but we read that it had some beautiful natural landscape. It does. The rules at this particular park were pretty lax. We didn't need a permit. There were a few basic laws/guidelines, but there was no check-in needed. We had all the basics and had planned to do a 6-day hike, 3 in, 3 out. The whole time we were out there we didn't see or hear another soul, but on day 1, we were prepping to move off trail and find a camping spot as it was getting near dusk. Half a mile off trail is usually the standard for us. We took what looked like kind of an animal trail, and about half a mile out we saw a green 2-person tent. It was almost camouflaged in the foliage, so we came on it almost by accident. Some backpackers prefer privacy, others are more social. We're the more social type. We've had some great experiences camping near other backpackers, sharing stories, food, and a joint or two. We were around 30 yards away from the tent. It was zip closed, so my boyfriend shouted a greeting to make our presence known. No movement and no sound. We assumed green tent guy either wasn't around or didn't want to be bothered, so we started off in a new direction to get some distance between us. We camped. Never heard a peep. We moved along the next morning, completely forgetting about green tent guy, until nearing the end of day 5 on our trek back. We were again looking for a spot to camp off the trail when we came up on the green tent again. This isn't that unusual, but normally backcountry hikers keep moving, so we really weren't expecting it. The tent flap was open, so my boyfriend yells his greeting again, and nothing. My boyfriend wants to go check it out, saying, "It's weird, and maybe someone is hurt." I didn't like the idea from the get-go, because even though we hadn't had any bad experiences personally, We'd heard enough stories from other backpackers about hermits and mountain men that want privacy, carry guns, etc. But my boyfriend assured me we'd be fine, and if all else fails, offer him some weed to keep the peace, and we'd go on our way. As soon as we get within 20 yards of the place, the smell of decomposition is intense. My boyfriend has been hailing his greeting over the last 20 yards, and once the smell hits him, he stops and turns to me and says, "What if we find a dead body?" My skin crawled. I was immediately afraid. I've never seen a dead body before, and don't want to. The closer we got to the tent, the worse the smell got. I knew for sure we were going to walk in and see some old camper's rotting corpse. What we found was worse than that. Outside the tent was a dead doe's legs, all 4 of them, covered in flies. It looked like the legs had been cut most of the way, and then ripped off the rest of the way. It was a mess. Inside was the body and head of the deer, but the middle portion was swaddled in a blue fleece blanket that was blood-soaked at the bottom where the legs used to be. It was laying on its side, bottom facing the tent entry. The tail had been cut off, and the anus/vagina was covered in dried blood and agape, like something had been penetrating it. The same with its mouth. The bottom portion was bent down at a scary broken-looking angle. The tent was open, so we could see everything without having to go inside. Not that we would have anyway, because at this point the smell was almost debilitating. There was a dirty, almost empty clear bottle of Jergens baby oil and a stained green and white fringed kitchen towel. That was it. I immediately started crying and begged him to go. All he could muster was, "What the fuck?" and we turned and ran. We ran to the trail and jogged down it for as far as we could go until dusk was fully on us, and we had to set up camp. We didn't go very far off the trail, and neither of us slept. We didn't start a fire or use headlamps after full dark. We just sat up whispering to each other, going over and over what we had just seen. Every little noise startled us. It was like our brains were on red alert. I kept thinking any moment a dead deer rapist would come back to his tent, see our footprints or something, know we were there and track us back to our tent. I've never been so scared in my entire life. Just before dawn we tore down and started out. My boyfriend stopped at the ranger station on our way out of the park to report what we had seen. The ranger was a young guy around our age, and he looked as freaked out by our story as we were telling it. He wrote most of it down, and my boyfriend showed him on a map approximately where it had been. He asked if we knew how the deer was killed, and at that point we hadn't even thought about it. We just assumed it had been shot, but because of the blanket we didn't see a wound, but we weren't exactly giving it an autopsy either. We have since shortened our backcountry hikes to a maximum of 4 days. We've also been a lot less eager to call out to other campsites, and have never approached another unmanned tent again. My friend, 25 female, from college told me a harrowing story that happened to her and her friends in high school. She is from Buffalo, New York, and often went on camping trips to local, upstate campgrounds. When she was a senior, her and 4 of her friends went to a campsite fitted with rows of cabins on the water that people could rent. As the sun went down, the girls noticed that their neighbors a few cabins down, a group of guys similar in age, were playing music and grooving around the campfire, drinking beers. One of the guys asked them all if they wanted to join. When they got over there and started hanging with the guys, everything seemed completely normal, and they were having a fun time. As the night progressed, one of the guys there started to get blackout drunk, and eventually pulled out a revolver that he said belonged to his dad. He started waving it around and playing with it. This obviously freaked everyone out, his own friends included. Eventually, he started pointing the gun to his head and laughing, while his friends were yelling at him to put it away, and how that wasn't funny. The girls at this point were fairly disturbed and told the guys that they should get back to their cabin and said their goodbyes. When they got back to their cabin, they all talked about how freaky that was and expressed concern for the drunk guy. They then moved on to other topics of conversation and forgot about it for the time being. A few hours later, sometime in the middle of the night, they heard a loud bang coming from the direction of their neighbor's cabin. Shortly after this, a brigade of cop cars showed up to the scene. One officer came to my friend's cabin and started asking them questions about the cabin they visited earlier that night. When my friend asked the officer what happened, he explained that the kid had shot himself in the head in front of his friends. They weren't able to discern if it was suicide or accidental. My friend to this day still has PTSD over this incident and explained that she rarely goes camping anymore. To understand my story, You sort of have to know a tiny bit about trespassing laws in our country, in that we don't have any so long as you're respectful and non-destructive. You can walk over any hills you like, and in my case, camp on any beach of your choosing, so long as once you leave the area is how you found it. I used to love camping when I was little. Our family would go multiple times a year with a large group of my parents' friends and their kids. On average, there were maybe 10 of us at a time, which was a bit of logistical challenge since we always headed out to this one really remote beach on the coast. Actually, we weren't the only ones. There are always yachts bobbing just off the shore with people in them and other campers lining up and down the beach. Most of them also had children or teenagers, so it wasn't a wild party scene. It was very much an informal family holiday spot. There was even a small building with toilets and showers installed nearby, even though this was the middle of nowhere. I guess the local council must have figured it out and got sick of people peeing behind bushes. We took a trip up in spring 2011. I'm really bad with time, but I know this because I got my dog in winter 2010, after picking her out that November from the shelter as a birthday gift from me, as I paid her adoption fee. Reddit, I know you love dogs, and she will be very important to the story later on. So let me tell you a little bit about Parmesan. Parmesan came to me as a 6-month-old puppy who had been rescued from a dog fighting situation. We're not entirely sure what breed she is exactly, but my best guess is a lurcher/staffy mix. She is a wonderfully well-tempered dog with people and most dogs, but you absolutely do not threaten her. She'll have you. So by the time of this camping trip, I'd had Parmesan for a few months. She'd never come camping with us before, but far as my family are concerned, dogs go on camping trips. So when we all piled into the car, she came too. Unusually though, none of the family friends could make it, so it was only me, my sister, my dad, and my mom. I didn't mind. I wasn't that attached to the other kids. I'd rather play with my dog, and I'd still have my sister. The drive took the best part of 6 hours, and because we'd left a bit later, although I don't remember why we'd left later than normal, we arrived at sunset. Not a good time to be building a tent, but we'd expected to arrive to other campers already set up and the beach illuminated in campfires. The beach was empty. In spite of this, my parents started taking stuff out and trying to build the tent. They asked us to fetch some of the lighter bags from the boot of the car, while they sat pointing a flashlight at the sand to see properly. I rolled down the window of the car for Parmesan before getting out. It was pretty hot for that time of year, and I wanted her to have air. Always gotta be looking out for my furry little homie. As we're fumbling about in the dark on a beach, in the middle of nowhere, it's pretty spooky. The one road that led to this beach was circular and had a bridge over the water, meaning you could basically circle around the beach like a big zero shape if you felt like it. I wasn't really paying any attention to the road. I was complaining I was tired, as kids are wont to do, but my mom was. After maybe 15 minutes of my dad trying to nail the tent into the sand, my mom's asking him had he seen that car drive round. It's been a few times. My dad kind of shrugged her off. He's sort of like that. I don't know if he said anything back to her, but after a few more minutes a car pulled up next to ours on the road, and someone got out. It was maybe 15 or 20 feet from the cars to where we were, and the light was pretty low, except for the torches. We weren't expecting to see anyone else out here at this point, and I think my mom said it must be the security. I don't know why a random beach would have security. I think what she meant was the Wildlife Trust or something, as they do occasionally come down to do their nosy. The guy was walking pretty unevenly. He must have been drunk or high because he had that stagger to him. There was absolutely no way this guy was sober. Cool. A junkie. Not an unusual find, but it's rare to see them in the wild. As he walked into flashlight range, we realized he was carrying a large knife, maybe 15 inches? Although I was small at the time, so maybe my sense of scale was off. I don't like my dad, but credit to him, once he saw this he got up immediately, holding onto the camping mallet, and put us all behind him. The man began to shout wildly at us that we can't camp here, and he was just letting us know. My dad tried to in Italy be a bit low-key with the guy and told him that was fine. We'd leave, but this didn't work. He kept coming closer to us, so my dad started shouting, and the man kept shouting back. My sister and I were crying. I remember shaking. I was utterly terrified, as I'm sure anyone would be in that situation. It really did seem like this guy and my dad were going to fight, and I'm going to be honest. I didn't fancy my dad's chances. While it's grim to consider, I'm absolutely convinced he would have killed my dad and possibly us as well once he was done, as I don't think my mother would have had the common sense to run with us. I love her, but she's always put Dad and her relationship with him above us. This isn't how it went down. A bolt from the black like a wolf descending on its prey took us all by surprise, most of all the man with the knife. In that moment, Parmesan was the apex predator large canines represent in nature. She got him good by the arm and clamped down hard, ripping his jacket and shredding the skin underneath. He dropped the knife as it had been in the arm she had got him by. He kicked her, he punched her, and eventually got her off. He grabbed the knife from the sand and ran back to his car and drove off. Parmesan didn't follow him. She stayed with us, muzzle covered in blood. Quickly as we could we gathered our things and all got back in the car, all pretty shook up by the incident. I looked Parmy over, she was okay, but the car's window was much more open than I'd left it. We think what happened was when the shouting started she must have put her paws up on the gap I'd left for her. As it was an old car and had the Raleigh down windows and not an electric button, we think she must have been able to hit it with her paws to force it down enough to squeeze out. This is not the end of my story. We were all pretty scared, and since we had the dog with us, we couldn't book into a hotel for the night. My parents decided just to drive home, so we could all feel safe, but first had to drive into the nearest town for petrol, as they were kind of low. I spent the time trying to clean Parmesan up a little. I'd always loved dogs, but what she'd just done for me blew my mind. As we drove into town, we came across a petrol station, but it looked closed. My dad drove up closer to get a better look and stuck his head out the window to get a better look at the sign. My mom asked him what on earth he was doing, and he told her he was trying to see when it opens. Never. My heart fucking sank. Parked in the corner, behind a van so we hadn't seen him at first, was the man with the knife. He was sitting on the bonnet of his car, using some tissue paper to clean up his arm. It looked pretty bad. Without stopping to refuel or look anywhere else in town, my dad drove right out of there. He decided to go to the next town over, but this was removed. The next town over was 60 miles away. He didn't have that much petrol, we realized as we began driving. We were going to break down. That's fine, Dad said. We had AA cover. They'd come tow us home, or at least to somewhere acceptable for the night. Better than staying in the last town. After driving for maybe 5 minutes, lights flash us from behind. Another car. The same car the man had been driving. It was him following us. He must have realized we were low on petrol. The next half hour was one of the worst half hours of my life. I had a complete and utter breakdown, as did everyone really. I could tell my parents were trying to keep it under wraps so it wouldn't upset us, but we weren't really little kids. We were both double digits. We knew how dangerous this situation was. Dad turned off the radio to conserve petrol, and the man followed us for 55 miles before he peeled away onto another road. Our fuel meter was on the big ready for empty for the last 10 miles. We were driving on fumes. I don't really believe in God, but if he does exist, that was definitely one of his miracles. Once we got there, we drove into a petrol station and refilled to a full tank before driving the rest of the way home. Sister and I slept in the car after that. I only woke up once we made it all the way home, just grateful nothing worse had happened than that. After getting some sleep, my mom phoned the non-emergency line for the police and reported what had happened. They never got back to her after that, but apparently the woman she spoke to said they may wish to in the future, as he matched the description given of a suspect wanted in relation to a murder charge. No idea if he actually was that guy or just a random psycho. As I said, they never got back to her. So what's the takeaway then? Other than crazy man on the beach, let's not meet. Well, for me it's that I love Parmesan. She's still with us now, old as the hills and twice as grizzled as one of my mom's friends likes to joke. I don't know why she did what she did that day. I couldn't tell you what her thought process was. What I do know is that this poor puppy was born into an environment where they abused and neglected her, only to be rescued and taken to a shelter where her mother and siblings all found homes before her. Despite how badly people had treated her, when I took her home she forgave but never forgot. I think the saying is I never trust a person who doesn't like a dog, but I always trust a dog when they don't like a person. They have a very good understanding of human body language, and I think she must have understood how much danger we were in. If you're able to, please adopt. You might find yourself in a situation like mine one day. I promise you, if you're willing to save a four-legged friend's life, they will pay you back tenfold if they're able to, without a thought for their own safety. I paid £78 for Parmesan's adoption fee, which is a lot when you're a kid, but it chills me to my bones knowing if I hadn't been so instant on a dog I might be dead. I live in Scotland, and this happened in the Highlands, fairly remotely. The drive took so long because we always used this one really specific beach, and the car was loaded down with camping supplies, 2 small children, and a dog. So the car was heavier than normal and pee breaks were frequent. You've all peed on the side of the motorway, don't at me. We didn't phone the police while being followed because we had no signal, or so my mum said, but I suspect the genuine reason was that there was weed in the car. My parents used to smoke/deal. I didn't include this in the original story because it didn't affect my experience of this story. I was a little kid, and I was telling it from my perspective as I remember it as per subreddit rules. Thank you all for the awards and saying so many sweet things about Parmy. I apologize for the length of this story. It's the most terrifying thing that I have ever experienced. This happened 4 years ago, when my boyfriend and I were still sort of fresh into the relationship. My sister had recommended me a snorkeling trip for a fun thing to do with him. It was this quarry surrounded by a campground that is filled in with water, and it's known for its crystal clear water and its diving. There's apparently a helicopter and school bus that people dive down to see. My boyfriend and I decided to go camping for the night. While we were checking in, we separately both got a bad feeling about the place, but had kept it to ourselves until after we left. So at first it was a really good time. We snorkeled in the shallowish area of the quarry, and although the depth of the water was a bit uncanny, I still was enjoying myself. The water is 65 feet deep, so once you had swam out of the shallow area, it immediately dropped off, and it was pitch black. This is actually where I realized I am terrified of water. Besides the dark, deep water while you were swimming, there is something very scary about a lake that is perfectly still. I assume BC it is a quarry the water doesn't have a current. My boyfriend and are winding down our night, and we're back at our campsite. We are camping in a grassy patch down a hill from the road. Our tent is pitched in a wooded area that our campsite is extended to, and just across the green is a campsite that looks well lived in, but our neighbors were out. We're making hot dogs over the fire when our neighbors get back. It's nighttime now, and they immediately go to sleep. I'd say 20 to 30 minutes after they get back is when things started to become spooky. My BF and I were chatting when we noticed a dark figure watching us from up the hill. Because of the shadow of the fire, we could not actually make out the characteristics of the figure, but we knew he was staring directly at us, almost hiding behind our neighbor's truck. He had watched us for what felt like forever until he started walking down the road again. We both watched him in dead silence, watching him walk behind trees. The same ones connected to our campsite, but that also went in between us and him. I anticipated each time I'd see him walk forward, out from behind a tree. It was a good 4 or 5 he came out from. It wasn't until after this I noticed he had stopped walking, or he was behind the tree still. I was totally freaked out. Where did he go? I watched my BF looking at what happened and thinking the same thing, but he had shrugged it off, and I naively did too. We actually ended up forgetting about it and went to the quarry late night. It was beautiful seeing the stars reflected against the water, but the deep, now all black water was terrifying to say the least. We walked back to our campsite, lied in our tent, and smoked a joint. I soon began to feel an uneasy feeling, which I was trying to ignore, telling myself it's because I was high. After some silence between us, my boyfriend says to me, "Do you feel like we're being watched?" I said, "Why would you say that?" half joking, but full serious that I was scared. My BF wanted to get out from the tent, so we're standing by my car, and I got this stupid idea that being in the middle of the field that's in the middle of the campground is the safest place for us. My logic being if someone was going to come up at us, at least we'd be able to see them. So we're in the middle of this field when we see a similar looking shadow figure from earlier staring at us. He must have been about 20 yards away. We both notice him while walking, and he's walking in the same direction as us. We change directions, and so does he. We tell one another if we change again, and he does too, that we're booking it to my car. When we change, he follows and we book it to the car. I watched him from my seat as he slowly walked back into the darkness while still staring in our direction. My boyfriend at this point says to me, "Let's get out of here." I agree, but all our camping gear is outside. We quietly get our things together, not trying to freak the other one out. The weirdest part of this story, in my opinion, is the next part. My headlights weren't working, and there was a weird fog over my windshield that didn't go away no matter what we did. We had to drive out of woods with only low beams and a strange fog over the window. We barely could see but got out of there. Weirdly enough, the fog went away right as soon as we go to the gas station. We got home around 1 at night. I told my father the story the next day, and he said he's glad we got out of there, or else we could have gotten murdered. 2 people have died at this campground while snorkeling, which I find out after I got back. My boyfriend, and I think it was either a person trying to kill us or a Wendigo. We've kinda settled on the Wendigo because what happened was so unexplainable to us. Thanks for reading.